In 1929, a woman named Anna Perskowski walked into a New Jersey courtroom and filed a lawsuit against her employer, the Johns Manville Corporation, claiming the mineral dust she breathed in every day on the factory floor had permanently damaged her lungs. Her case was, as far as historians can determine, the very first asbestos-related lawsuit ever filed in the United States. She lost. The court found insufficient evidence to establish that her employer bore any responsibility for her condition, and Anna Perskowski returned home with her illness and no compensation at all. One ordinary factory worker against one of the largest industrial manufacturers in the country. Inside the company she had just sued, executives were already quietly aware, in ways her own lawyers could never have proven at the time, that her illness was neither rare nor accidental. It would take more than 5 decades, hundreds of thousands of additional sick and dying workers, and one of the largest documented corporate cover-ups in American industrial history before the full scope of what that company already knew in 1929 would finally come to light. The substance at the center of this story had been prized for thousands of years before anyone understood what it was quietly doing to the people who handled it. Asbestos occurs naturally as a fibrous mineral that can be woven into cloth, mixed into building materials, or spun into insulation, and it possesses one genuinely remarkable property that made it seem almost magical to people across many different eras and cultures. It does not burn. Ancient civilizations occasionally wove it into ceremonial cloth, specifically to demonstrate its resistance to fire, and some ancient writers reportedly noted, with evident concern, that slaves who worked the mineral seemed to suffer from a peculiar sickness of the lungs, an early, largely forgotten warning that would go unheeded for the better part of 2,000 years. But asbestos remained a curiosity rather than an industrial cornerstone until the 19th century, when rapidly industrializing economies discovered they could mine it by the ton and weave it into virtually anything that needed to resist heat: insulation for pipes and boilers, fireproof roofing shingles, brake linings for the booming automobile industry, and countless other products that quickly became essential to modern construction and manufacturing. Companies like Johns Manville, founded by Henry Ward Johns and C.B. Manville, grew into industrial giants almost entirely on the strength of this single, seemingly miraculous mineral. And by the early 20th century, asbestos had become one of the most widely used industrial materials on the entire planet, embedded quite literally inside the walls, ceilings, and machinery of an enormous share of the modern built world. The workforce that mined, processed, and manufactured asbestos products expanded dramatically across the 20th century, employed in mills, textile factories, shipyards, and construction sites across the industrialized world. Workers spent entire shifts in rooms thick with a fine, invisible dust of microscopic asbestos fibers, coating their clothes, their hair, and their lungs, day after day, year after year, with essentially no protective equipment or ventilation standards in place for most of the industry's early history. Demand for asbestos surged to genuinely enormous levels during the Second World War, when American shipyards used it by the ton to insulate boilers, pipes, and engine rooms aboard warships and merchant vessels being built at a wartime pace unlike anything the industry had ever experienced before. Historians estimate that millions of American shipyard workers were exposed to significant quantities of asbestos dust during this single wartime industrial surge alone, a hidden, decades-delayed cost of the war effort that would not fully reveal itself in hospital wards and mortality statistics until long after those same shipyards had gone quiet. The very property that made asbestos so commercially valuable, its complete resistance to breaking down or burning away, was exactly what made it so dangerous once inhaled. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Microscopic asbestos fibers, once lodged deep inside human lung tissue, do not dissolve, break down, or get expelled by the body's normal defenses the way most inhaled particles eventually are. They remain there permanently, causing slow, progressive scarring of lung tissue that gradually and irreversibly reduces a person's ability to breathe, a condition that came to be known as asbestosis. In more severe cases, asbestos exposure triggers an aggressive, almost always fatal form of cancer called mesothelioma, which attacks the thin lining surrounding the lungs and other internal organs. Unlike many of the occupational hazards in this show, asbestos-related disease frequently does not appear until decades after the original exposure, sometimes 20, 30, or even 40 years later, meaning that a worker could handle asbestos for only a few months early in their career and still develop a fatal illness decades afterward, long after they had moved on to an entirely different job, in some documented cases even after they had already retired and left the industry behind entirely. This unusually long latency period would later prove to be one of the industry's most useful tools for avoiding accountability, since it became genuinely difficult for any single sick worker to prove definitively which employer, among possibly several across a working lifetime, bore direct responsibility for a disease that might not surface until decades after the actual exposure occurred. Medical warnings about asbestos began accumulating remarkably early, and were remarkably consistently ignored by the companies best positioned to act on them. In 1930, British physician E.R.A. Merewether and engineer C.W. Price published a landmark report documenting asbestosis in an extraordinary 66% of long-term asbestos workers examined, a finding significant enough to prompt the very first asbestos safety regulations anywhere in the world, introduced in Britain shortly afterward. In the United States, Johns Manville's own internal medical reports by 1933 had already confirmed that asbestos dust was directly causing disease among its own workforce. Rather than warning those workers or the wider public, the company chose a different path entirely. That same year, Johns Manville's own board of directors quietly paid off 11 asbestosis victims in New Jersey, specifically securing an agreement from the lawyer representing them that he would never file any further asbestos-related claims against the company again. If you're finding this story as unsettling as we do, go ahead and hit subscribe. We dig into a new deadly job from history every week, and what this particular company did next is genuinely hard to believe. In 1935, two of the most powerful men in the American asbestos industry, Sumner Simpson, president of Asbestos Manhattan, and Vandiver Brown, an attorney for Johns Manville, exchanged a series of letters that would later become some of the most damning documentary evidence in the history of American corporate wrongdoing. The two men discussed, in explicit and deliberate terms, a coordinated strategy to suppress emerging medical research linking asbestos to serious lung disease and to actively control what independent scientific publications were allowed to say about it. Simpson himself put the strategy into blunt, chillingly simple words in a letter to a Johns Manville attorney, writing that the less said about asbestos, the better off the industry would be. The companies went considerably further than simply staying quiet. They actively funded ongoing asbestos research conducted at the independent Saranac Laboratory, a respected research institution whose scientific credibility made its findings especially valuable to an industry seeking outside validation. And when the resulting findings proved unfavorable to their business interests, industry representatives edited the studies before publication, softening or removing language that more directly implicated their own products in causing serious illness among the very workers who manufactured them. Dr. Anthony Lanza, Assistant Medical Director at Metropolitan Life Insurance, conducted a separate industry commission study around this same period, and that manuscript too was edited by Johns Manville and Asbestos Manhattan before it ever reached publication, downplaying findings the companies considered commercially inconvenient. When a routine safety inspection was later scheduled at a Johns Manville factory in New Jersey, Metropolitan Life itself intervened to help block it, and Lanza separately objected to the simple act of posting asbestos warning signs inside a company plant in Illinois, citing concern over what he termed the potential legal situation such warnings might create. The pattern of concealment continued for decades, growing only more elaborate as the medical evidence against the industry grew increasingly difficult to ignore. In 1949, a physician named Dr. Kenneth Smith sent Johns Manville headquarters a formal memo describing 7 mill workers whose chest X-rays already showed clear early signs of asbestosis. Smith would go on to become the company's own chief medical director, and in that role, he explicitly advised Johns Manville against informing sick workers of their own diagnosis at all, reasoning in an internal company document that as long as a man remained capable of working, he should not be told about his condition. Entire generations of asbestos workers spent years, in some documented cases decades, laboring inside company facilities with visible medically documented lung damage, never once informed by the very doctors examining them that anything was seriously wrong, continuing to breathe the same contaminated air shift after shift, while the only people with genuine knowledge of the danger deliberately withheld it from them. Similar patterns of concealment surfaced at other major asbestos manufacturers during this same period. In 1958, executives at the National Gypsum Company privately acknowledged, in an internal memo, that workers handling asbestos were, in their own words, as certain as death and taxes to eventually develop asbestosis from inhaling the dust, an admission of near-total certainty that, like so many before it, was carefully kept from the workers themselves. The independent scientific evidence, meanwhile, continued mounting steadily outside the industry's direct control. In 1955, British epidemiologist Sir Richard Doll published a landmark study in the British Journal of Industrial Medicine establishing a definitive statistical link between asbestos exposure and lung cancer, specifically among textile workers, a study that gave the growing body of individual case reports a rigorous, peer-reviewed statistical foundation impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. In 1960, physician J.C. Wagner published a separate, equally significant paper documenting 33 confirmed cases of mesothelioma among asbestos miners and nearby residents in South Africa's Northern Cape province, work that helped firmly establish, for the first time in the broader medical literature, the direct causal connection between asbestos exposure and this particularly aggressive, fatal cancer. And crucially, Wagner's study showed the disease striking not only miners themselves, but people who had simply lived near the mines, never having worked with the mineral directly at all. Perhaps most consequentially of all, in 1964, the American physician Irving Selikoff published a comprehensive epidemiological mortality study documenting a dramatically excessive death rate from asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma among insulation workers specifically, research that finally began breaking through into mainstream public and political awareness, in a way earlier, more scattered studies had failed to achieve. That same year, a separate study commissioned by Philip Carey Manufacturing reached a strikingly blunt conclusion of its own, describing an irrefutable association between asbestos exposure and both lung cancer and mesothelioma, with the study's own author specifically emphasizing that meaningful cancer risk existed even after what he described as slight and intermittent exposure to the mineral, undermining any remaining industry argument that only heavy, prolonged occupational exposure posed genuine danger. Internal industry attitudes toward this mounting body of evidence remained, by any reasonable modern standard, genuinely shocking. In 1966, a purchasing director at the Bendix Corporation, an asbestos manufacturer, wrote in an internal company memo that if an employee had enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, there was little reason to complain about eventually dying from that same exposure. A sentence that, once eventually made public, would come to symbolize the entire industry's decades-long attitude toward the workers whose labor had built its fortunes. Johns Manville itself, in 1970, established a public relations organization called the Asbestos Information Association, an outward-facing group specifically designed to minimize public concern about the industry's product, even as internal company knowledge of the associated health risks had, by that point, existed in explicit written form for close to 4 full decades. The association's own materials, distributed to manufacturers, retailers, and members of the public, described asbestos as an essential product with no demonstrated risk to the general public. Language that stood in direct, documented contradiction to the company's own confidential internal research files, sitting in the very same corporate offices that had approved the public messaging. The full extent of what companies like Johns Manville had known, and for how long, did not become fully public until 1977, when a group of mesothelioma lawyers pursuing litigation on behalf of sick and dying workers uncovered the company's own internal archive of memos, letters, and suppressed research reports stretching back across the entire 20th century. Perhaps the single most damning piece of evidence to emerge from this discovery came not from a written document at all, but from a 1984 legal deposition, when Johns Manville's own former president, Lewis Brown, was directly asked whether the company had knowingly allowed workers to die from asbestos exposure simply to keep using the profitable material. Brown's recorded answer was strikingly, almost casually direct. "Yes," he said. "The company saved a great deal of money that way." The financial and legal reckoning that followed was, even by the standards of American corporate history, genuinely enormous. Facing an overwhelming and rapidly growing wave of asbestos-related lawsuits, Johns Manville filed for bankruptcy protection in 1982, ultimately setting aside $2.5 billion specifically to compensate the workers and families harmed by its products, establishing what became known as the Manville Trust in 1988, a model subsequently copied by dozens of other asbestos manufacturers facing similarly overwhelming legal liability. The Manville bankruptcy proved historically significant well beyond its own industry, becoming one of the first and largest cases in which an American corporation used federal bankruptcy law specifically as a tool to manage and limit mass tort liability from product-related injuries, a legal strategy that numerous other industries facing their own large-scale product liability crises would later study and, in various forms, imitate. Residents of Manville, New Jersey itself, the very town named after the company that had operated there for generations, later recalled watching what they described as asbestos snow drifting through their own neighborhood streets on ordinary afternoons, fine mineral fibers settling quietly onto lawns, rooftops, and playground equipment for years before anyone outside the company understood exactly what they were watching fall from the sky. Local residents, including family members of factory workers who had never themselves set foot inside the plant, eventually won a jury award of $90.5 million for wrongful deaths directly connected to that ambient community exposure, a stark demonstration that the company's asbestos dust had never respected the boundary between its own factory floor and the ordinary residential streets surrounding it. Regulatory efforts to formally restrict asbestos in the United States arrived only very late, and even then met immediate, well-funded resistance. In 1989, following a 10-year federal study, the Environmental Protection Agency moved to phase out virtually all remaining uses of asbestos across American industry. Just 2 years later, in 1991, the United States Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that ban entirely, following sustained legal pressure from the very industry it had targeted. And for more than 3 decades afterward, asbestos remained legally available in a range of American products, despite everything documented across 6 decades of internal industry knowledge. Only in March of 2024 did the Environmental Protection Agency finally ban the last legal form of asbestos still used in the country, a ban the industry immediately challenged in that very same Fifth Circuit Court, with a ruling still pending. More than 60 separate asbestos compensation trusts now exist in the United States, collectively holding tens of billions of dollars specifically set aside to pay claims from workers and family members sickened by asbestos exposure that, in a great many documented cases, occurred decades earlier. The Manville Trust alone has paid out more than $4 billion to claimants since its creation, and continues to receive thousands of new claims every single year, a direct reflection of asbestos-related diseases' uniquely long latency period. Workers exposed on ordinary factory floors during the 1960s and 1970s are, right now, still being newly diagnosed with the same fatal lung diseases documented in Johns Manville's own internal medical files half a century earlier, individual pieces of the same slow-moving industrial tragedy still arriving, one diagnosis at a time, more than 90 years after Anna Pierskowski first walked into a New Jersey courtroom and lost. Anna Pierskowski never lived to see the full extent of what her employer had actually known back in 1929, when her own lawsuit was dismissed for lack of sufficient proof. She had simply gone to work each day inside a factory that seemed, to her and to nearly everyone else at the time, entirely ordinary, handling a mineral widely celebrated as one of the great practical miracles of the modern industrial age. She could not have known that the very executives who successfully defended themselves against her claim already possessed internal knowledge suggesting her illness was neither unusual nor accidental. Knowledge they would continue actively concealing, refining, and defending in court for more than 5 decades to come. She could not have known, either, that her own failed lawsuit would turn out to be merely the first documented skirmish in a legal and medical battle that would eventually span nearly a full century, consume the fortunes of some of the largest industrial corporations in American history, and still, even now, continue generating new diagnoses among workers who have not yet realized that a job they held decades ago has already begun quietly killing them. The insulation, the roofing shingles, the brake linings that once carried her employer's name into millions of ordinary homes and vehicles across the country were, quite literally, built on top of a mineral the company's own leadership understood was killing the very workers who manufactured it and chose, again and again, across generation after generation of quietly sick and dying employees, that continuing to profit from it was worth the cost. Somewhere in an old New Jersey courthouse archive, the original 1929 filing bearing Anna Pierskowski's name likely still exists. A single dismissed lawsuit that, had anyone at the time possessed the internal company documents that would not surface for another 50 years, might have changed the outcome of everything that followed. If this one surprised you, subscribe for more. We cover a new deadly job from history every week, and there are far darker ones still to come.